Are you in the right place? Given everything going on in the world, are you in the right place? What is the right place? Many of us are torn right now by attitudes we carry, thoughts, feelings we hold concerning issues like the verdict announced just 2 days ago in the city of St. Louis about a killing that happened more than 5 years ago. Most all of us have strong feelings, strong opinions about what happened then and now. I'm one of them. And strong opinions arise from strong emotions and lead to even stronger emotions. And yet, if we are good people who are even a little bit self-aware, we are somewhat disturbed, troubled by our own strong feelings and opinions, and not sure how to have them and still be a person who lives up to our own ideals, our own ideal self, ourself as we see ourselves as disciples of Jesus of Nazareth, as a people on the way with him. For most of us, something seems amiss right here, not just out there, but right here, something seems amiss. What is the right place for our hearts to be right now? Truth is, and these readings make it clear, I am only really responsible in the end for where my heart is, and not where everybody else's heart is. If he or she has a heart full of rage, that is not mine to fix or be troubled over even, and certainly not mine to react to in the same way. I need to be troubled. I need to be disturbed over where my heart is, and I am, or is not, and do my work, not theirs, and I'm trying. That sense of unease, that sense of dis-ease, is even broader for many of us than Friday's verdict. What is the right place for our hearts to be towards our president or our last president? Toward the left or the right? Toward those on the opposite side of us and the liturgical wars that have been raging in the church since the 40s concerning the traditionalists who want to change nothing and the progressives who want to change everything? What is the right place for our hearts to be towards the black community in this city and every city, and towards the police in this city and every city? What is the right place for us to be with the demonstrators who block the streets and riot? What is the right place to be regarding this verdict about a crime that happened more than 5 years ago that perhaps we disagree with? Whether it is the liturgical traditionalist or the progressive, the people in Congress across the aisle from us, the people north of Delmar or south, the city or the county, as Sirach, our first reading, expresses so well, and I don't think this is an accident that this confronts us this morning. This is the book of wisdom. This is wisdom. Wrath and anger are hateful things. My anger, my rage is a hateful thing. Yet the sinner hugs them tight. Even though I know something's amiss in me, I cling to that anger and that hurt, that hatefulness. The sinner hugs their anger. The sinner hugs. I like to hug. But I don't want to be hugging my anger. Most of us, I suspect, are hugging our anger these days. But there's another verdict rendered in that gospel story you just heard proclaimed. Jesus tells us of a man who had a servant who owed him an exorbitant amount of money. And so he had compassion on that service. He felt compassion, and so he forgave the debt. But then the servant had somebody who owed him money. And that was also an exorbitant amount of money. But the servant did not have any compassion on that servant who owed him money. None, even though the master had compassion on him. And so he denied it and wouldn't give him any experience of mercy, any experience of compassion. And the verdict was severe. The verdict that day in another trial was severe: torment. He sent them into torment. He sent him into torment. And the truth is, when we who've been received with so much compassion do not return compassion for others, that's the verdict on us as well, and it's torment. We are tormented. That verdict doesn't have to come from outside of us, it comes from inside of us, and we are tormented. Something's amiss. Something's not right. We're disturbed. We're troubled by something. Because we stopped the flow, We stopped the flow of compassion. I let myself receive it, but I didn't give it. That's the verdict on us. Whatever else we may think or do, feel, or the intensity of our emotions, the bottom line for Jesus is compassion. That's the right place. Compassion is the right place. Anything else will leave us in torment. It will leave us uneasy and part of the problem. You and I, we need to make a place in our hearts for empathy, that in turn makes a place in our hearts for compassion, that in turn makes a place in our hearts for forgiveness. We must make a place in our hearts for empathy, which opens up a place for compassion, which opens up a place for forgiveness. That's the right place. There is not a human being in all the world who does not deserve compassion, even if we think they don't deserve us because they were so mean to us, so destructive to our world, so wrong. And even if they are not making a place for compassion for me or for my side of the argument, if I am to ever be in the right place, if I'm going to be in the right place, then I have to allow myself empathy for this disagreeable person and compassion for them. And that in them that leads them to this destructiveness, this bullying, this violence against people and property. That in them that leads them to be a racist, this wrong judgment, this rage, this self-righteousness. I must allow myself empathy for the disagreeable person. Granted, people need to be held accountable for breaking the law, yes, and bearing that consequence, yes. But I can still respond to that with compassion, that person, yes, over, not once, not 7 times, but 70 times, 7 times, over and over and over and over again, because empathy, compassion, and forgiveness is the only thing that can end racism, and it can. It is the only thing that can end all the other isms, and it can. It is the only thing that works, and it is the only thing that can transform a whole society. I'm telling you, I know it. It's hard enough to feel empathy and compassion for others if I'm not suffering. That's already hard. It's like being in St. Louis where the weather's beautiful and knowing a hurricane is raging on two coasts of the United States, turning people's homes into matchboxes, flattened. And how do I connect with that? How do I have empathy for that when I'm sitting here outside having dinner with a beautiful day that have spoiled me? How do I have, it's hard enough to have empathy and compassion when we're that distant emotionally from other people who are suffering. But it's even harder to have empathy. It's even harder to have empathy for someone who hates me, or who's destroying our property. It's so hard to get to a place, the right place of empathy and compassion. Yet if I get to that place, if I get underneath the psyche of that bully, that violent person, there's always a sadness there. There's a broken heart. There's a broken heart, and it's bleeding into the streets of our cities. Underneath that awful behavior that disturbs so much, there's a bleeding heart. If we can get to it. We just sang, the Lord is kind and merciful, slow to anger, rich in compassion. Well, if God's that, and I'm Gary, and I'm in the image, likeness of God, why am I not full of mercy and forgiveness and compassion? And why am I not slow to anger? Why? Because you know the difference between God and me? God sees right away. God knows the heart of the sinner. God knows the broken place that was underneath that behavior. God sees that. And when you see that, you're so kind. You become kinder, more patient, less judgmental, because you're attending to that broken place in that man or that woman's heart that's bleeding out into the world. I remember back to the days of Vietnam. It was a tough time for America. It really was. It was a tough time for WashU. And there were riots in the streets all around Washington University during Vietnam. The ROTC building was burned to the ground. The chancellor's wife refused to let them live anywhere near campus because of their kids. So they had to buy a house out in West County and commute because it was so dangerous for the chancellor to live here. But it wasn't just Vietnam, it wasn't the streets of WashU, it was the streets of my kitchen table with my family. Saturday nights during Vietnam became a war zone. And I let them become a war zone for us. I created my own Vietnam at the family table. Saturday night dinners were those places where I declared war on people who disagreed with me in my own family. And if I could have even just been a little more reflective and a little more self-aware, I would have seen that and begun to start from a different place. I would have let myself feel empathy first and compassion for where those members of my own family, my mom and my dad and my brother, were coming from. That was different from where I was coming from. And I would have not been so pushing and pulling toward my righteous ideas, even if I was proved right. We create our own Vietnams, you know, when we start with the head instead of the heart. I'd like to close this morning with a story I found quite moving and quite challenging, and that totally resonates with the gospel that brought us here today. One day, a 7-year-old boy was riding in the back seat of his family car. He was sitting between his two brothers, and their mother was driving. On this day, she was feeling especially distraught. She had recently been abandoned by their father. Suddenly, in a fit of anger, she turned and she struck her 7-year-old son. She struck him with a blow right across his face. Then she yelled at him, "And you," she shouted, "and you, I never wanted you. The only reason I had you was to keep your father." But he left anyway. I hate you, she shouted to her son. That scene branded itself on that little boy's memory. Over the years, the mother reinforced everything she said to him that day. She constantly found fault with him. Years later, the boy told his friend, I can't tell you how many times in the last 23 years I relived that experience. Probably thousands. But then he added, but recently, I put myself in my mother's shoes. Here she was, a high school graduate, with no money, no job, abandoned by her husband, and a family to support all by herself. I realized how lonely, how depressed she might have felt. I thought of the anger and the pain that must have been there inside of her. And I thought of how much I must have reminded her of the failure of her young hopes. And so one day, I decided to visit her and talk with her. I told her that I understood her feelings and that I loved her. I loved her just the same. She broke down, and we wept in each other's arms for what seemed like hours. It was the beginning of a new life for me, for her, for us. You see, my friends, he hugged his hurt, he hugged his anger for 20 years. And you and I, we can empathize with that rage in him. We get it. Oh my gosh. He was so wrong. That was brutal. And it could have destroyed his life. But what finally broke through for him was that when he opened a space for empathy, which opened a space for compassion, which opened a space for forgiveness, that, my friends, is the right place.